Okay, welcome everyone to this message. It's great to be together. Yeah, thank you to everyone connecting into this, whether you're joining us online, whether you're watching on TV, whether you're in a Freedom Church location. I really pray that the message that I'm going to share with you today impacts you and brings something to your life in this season we're in Freedom Church right now. We're in a series called Regeneration. And we've been thinking and talking about the fact that there's generation to generation, and we're part of this kind of generational sort of flow that goes on. And we get to choose about what we carry in our lives and what we pass on to the next generation. And that's what we're going to be thinking about this morning. In my life, I've noticed that I will spend time thinking about what success is because, I don't know, you may be like me, I want to be successful in my life. You know, I don't think any of us set out in life to be an unmitigated failure and to do really badly, do we? Nobody says, you know what, the thing that I really want to do in life is make a complete mess. No, we all say, I want to be successful. But if you're anything like me, you may have noticed that success at times seems like a moving target. You know, there are different ways of measuring success, aren't there? You know, an easy way of measuring success perhaps is material success. I'm successful if I have a certain amount of money in my bank account, if I live in a certain type of house, if I drive a certain type of car. And it's true that, you know, you see somebody driving around in a Rolls Royce. I saw somebody tweet this week that they failed their A-levels, but they have a really nice car, therefore they're successful. It was encouragement for all the students out there around the world that struggled in their A-level results this week. So you could say, you know, there's material measures of success. I think as well there are status measures of success. You know, we switch on the TV, we see the whole celebrity culture. And there's this sense that if you're on TV, if you're a household brand, then you've attained a certain level of success in your life. But again, I think we would all say that actually the media also makes us aware that some of the most well-known people can be some of the most unhappy people in life. So, okay, that doesn't look like success either. So let's just talk about happiness for a minute. I was listening to the radio a few weeks ago, and somebody was being interviewed on the radio, and this person said, you know, I had a great dad. He told me, in life, just do whatever makes you happy. And I thought at the time, that's terrible advice. If I did whatever makes me happy, it would be an absolute disaster, wouldn't it? So there's something about happiness being important, but some of the most important things that we have to do in life don't necessarily make us happy. They may cost us something. They may cost us at times measures of happiness. So let's scrap that one as well. We as a church recently, we had this thing called The Cave. It's a gathering of our people, of our locations from around the world. And this year we talked about eternity. And I think we introduced more into the conversation eternal measures of success. The whole idea that for each of us, we live a life, and through that life, we store up treasures in heaven. That's an interesting measure of success. Sometimes it's hard to know how much treasure you're storing up, right? Sometimes you think you're doing well, other times not so well. Anyway, the eternal measure of success. Well, today I want to talk about something that connects in with this regeneration series, which is the idea of generational success. Generational success. Yeah, unusual topic. So talking about success, today I want us to think about the whole concept of succession. And this is my definition of succession. That, you know, we live from generation to generation. All of us live a life that passes something on to the next generation. All of us live a life that receives something into the next generation. And succession is that idea of from generation to generation, there's kind of a passing on and a following on from what's gone before. Now, I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about the fact that many of the measures of success in life treat life like it's a sprint. Anybody here used to do running at school? You know, most of us were forced to, weren't we? And, you know, if you were running in a sprint, you would start at the starting blocks, and you'd run 100 meters, never my race. The 200 meters, slightly better at that. 400 meters, never made it to the end. Anyway. The two, you know, it's a long race, isn't it? And then somebody said, let's run a kilometer. It's like, what's wrong with you? Anyway, let's not talk about that. You know, we can treat life like it's a sprint, that we start it and we end it. And the only thing that really matters is what we achieve between those 2 points. Material wealth, for example. Status, for example. Happiness, for example. It treats life like a sprint. But I don't think that life is anything like that. I actually think that life is more like the relay race. Now, me even getting this out and showing this will strike fear into the hearts of many, because some of us remember the relay race, don't they? So, right, who wants to volunteer for the relay race? Coppock, you're up. Oh, no. The reason that the relay race was such a dreaded thing was the fact that the relay race wasn't like a sprint. I mean, a sprint, it's hard to mess up the start of a race, especially in school nowadays, because if you can't do that whole crouching down thing, they'll say to you, oh, just stand up and start. I mean, it's easy, isn't it? You can't really get it wrong. Then you just have to run in a straight line or run around the corner and cross the line. Easy job. Not with the relay race. Because the relay race involves, particularly if you're somewhere in the middle, number 2, number 3, which I often was, the relay race involves you having to receive this into your hand from a fast-moving object, yeah? Under great pressure and duress, I have to say, all eyes on you. Some of you know what I'm talking about, don't you? It comes into your hand, and then, having figured out how you're going to catch it from this thing that's charging towards you, you then have to run really fast, whilst being overtaken probably by everybody else. No. Somebody sat here going, actually, I was the one doing the overtake. Okay, good for you. Anyway, you run all the way there, and if that's not enough, you then have to put this in the hand of another person who, as you approach them, starts moving as well. It's a very complicated affair, the relay race. But isn't that much more how life is? I think that's much more how life is. It's like a relay. We receive something into our hands, we carry it through our life, and we then have a responsibility to pass it on to somebody else who comes next. It's the way it is. Now, in the relay, what I realized in my short-lived relay career is that, firstly, in the relay, you don't know how you have done until you have released the baton. You don't really know how you've done until you've released the baton, because it's very easy, many of us may have done this, it's very easy to actually have received the baton well, have run like, Usain Bolt, but in slow motion, and then have put this into the hands of the person in front of you, or have dropped it on the way. You can mess up that moment of transition, or you can put it in their hands and they start running. It's only then when you stop and you look and you say, how are we doing in the race? And it's hard to measure it while you're running. It's only once you've placed the baton into somebody's hands, until you've released the batons, that you realize how well you've done. And I think our lives are this way as well. We can measure, think about, this is something that applies to the whole of our life, but it also applies to the seasons of our life as well. If you've had a job in a workplace, for example, you may have been the best person ever to have done that job. But if you mess up the handover to your successor, it's going to reflect, isn't it, upon how well you've done your job. People are going to say, they did a fantastic job, but when it came to handing over, they really, the way they passed on the baton really messed it up for everyone. So there's something important about the way that we transition. And this is why I think our success is measured in the next generation. Our success is measured in the next generation. And this, for me, this makes life a lot more complicated. At least if you're measuring your success by your bank balance, you have an actual number. But if we're measuring our success in the next generation, things are getting slightly more complicated for us. The second thing about the relay is this: how we receive, how we carry, and how we pass on the baton actually all matter. How we receive, how we carry, and how we pass on the baton matters. We have to be conscious of and thinking about this through our life. It's not just that we can have a short season of success. We have to be thinking about and engaging with this stuff all the days of our life as we receive things into our life and as we pass things on through our life as well. So it kind of broadens the field in terms of measures of success. Now, this is why I think that's important, because I think succession matters because our lives have a generational impact. And I was thinking about this. We can say, you know what? I don't want to have a generational impact. I'm going to kind of get halfway through the race and I'm going to duck out of the race and I'm going to stop at that point. That has as much a generational impact as running all the way, running fast, putting the baton into somebody's hand, and then they move forward. It's not like, if I was in the relay, for example, and I was runner number 3 and I receive this, and I get halfway along and I think, well, I never wanted to do this anyway. So I just sit down, I grab it, and I throw it over their heads. It's not like I can say, well, that was the end of the race. No, that wasn't the end of the race. The race continued, but the line that I was in, the team that I was a part of, those that came after me, suffered the consequences, right, of my handling of this baton. Succession matters as our lives have a generational impact. Now, I just want to quickly bring this to light, and because I really believe this is relevant to all of us. This week, or was it last week? I don't know. I've got a newborn baby. It's all a bit misty. But anyway, recently I went to see the new Mission Impossible film. Has anyone seen the new Mission Impossible film? Okay, it's been a big hit in Hereford. That's good. That's me and you. We went. That's good. Okay, and the new Mission Impossible film was absolutely fantastic as an action movie. But what I noticed when I read some reviews about the new Mission Impossible film is people said, you know what, it's the best Mission Impossible film yet. It's a really great film. It builds on the success of the franchise. The Mission Impossible film could be the best film ever, but it's always going to get measured and weighed in comparison to the films that came before it. And I just want to say it is actually fantastic. Because it builds on the storyline, it answers some of the questions. Some of the characters from the old film reappear in the new film, and it resolves what happens in their life. But it's a great example of how, whether they like it or not, the makers of that film, it's always going to be subject to what has come before, and it's always going to be compared to what has come before as well. And the question we were all asking as we left the cinema is, hey, what comes next? I cannot wait for the next Mission Impossible film. Think about it, Succession, that's Succession for you. Think about Succession in families. Naomi and I are committed to wanting to give our kids the best start in life. We have 5 of them. We had 5 because we figured with 5, at least 3 you could get right. You know what I'm saying? That's a joke. My wife is shaking her head at me going, just 2. Anyway, okay, so you want to give your kids the best start in life. But if you give your kids a good start in life and then the rest of life absolutely sucks for them, you're going to stop, aren't you, as parents? You're going to say, okay, what could we have done differently? Now, that's not to say as parents we're responsible for the decisions that they make. They have to make their own choices. They have to go their own way. But there is something about, as we invest in them as parents, we want them to go further than we've gone in our lives. We want them to be happier. We want them to achieve more, recognizing that in a sense, their ability to become all that God has called them to be reflects upon the way we've set them up in life. Succession matters to all of us. Think about it in church. It's a massive discussion in the church world. You can have a great leader of a church movement and they can lead a church to be thousands strong and achieve great things. But if when others take over from where that leader finishes up, the whole thing crashes and burns. Everybody stands there and goes, okay, what was it about their leadership that didn't set up the next generation to win? Succession matters to all of us. A couple more examples. Just stick with me on this. I really want to make the point that it doesn't matter what we're talking about or looking at in life. Succession matters. I used to work for an organization that helped people who had started their own businesses and had done very well. People who maybe worth 50 million pounds, 100 million pounds, 500 million pounds. And what we found when we did some research is the biggest concern that those business leaders had was not the continued success of the business or competition. It was passing on leadership of the business to the next generation. These were family businesses, and the business leaders had done really, really well. And they were looking at the next generation going, what happens if I pass over this business and they screw it all up? They make a mess of it. There's something about succession. It matters to all of us. And finally, I lived in a country where it's not going to take some people very long to figure out where I'm talking about, but I thought I'd be diplomatic. Anyway, I lived in a country where they'd had the same president for about 100 years. It wasn't 100, it was about 30 years. And one of the things that was said about this president, that he felt that he was the only one who could lead the nation. And you couldn't help but think, as there were elections that he won over and over again, very predictable outcome to elections. Actually, there's something quite appealing about that. But anyway, as there were elections that he was winning over and over again, you couldn't help but think, hey, you may have brought this nation together. You may have built this nation for a number of generations now. But what comes next is really going to be the defining measure of your success. Because if the whole thing crumbles, what does that say about the way that you led? Succession matters to all of us, and I think succession matters to God as well. It's an outstanding feature in the Bible. Jesus, all of us have heard of Jesus. This may be your first time in church. I think you will have heard of Jesus. The Bible records the story of Jesus in 4 books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The first of those, Matthew, opens with what's called a genealogy of Jesus. It records the generation to generation succession that comes before Jesus, all the way back to a man named Abraham. 14 generations from Abraham to David are recorded. 14 generations from David to exile. 14 generations from exile to Jesus. There's something about that record. It's saying, what comes before, the passing on, succession, the baton from generation to generation is important. God's sending us a sign in that. And then look at how Jesus lived out his own ministry. He had no wife. He had no children. Yet there was something about the way that he led, that his group of adherents, his group of followers went from a small handful of people into the hundreds, into the thousands, into the millions, into the billions. Now, throughout his life, Jesus was meeting people, like the legion, the man he met on the shores of the lake, who was so troubled and so broken. What does Jesus do? He heals him, he fixes him up, and then what does he say to him? Go out. Be a missionary to the Decapolis, to the 10 cities. Go reach the Gentiles in this region. Jesus was so good at succession. Succession matters to all of us, and I believe that succession matters to God. So we're going to look today at what I believe the Bible has to say about succession. It's going to be a slightly different message in that we're going to be thinking about the big picture of the Bible as much as we're thinking about some specific verses in the Bible. And there are two really important themes that I want to bring to life. Now, just a warning, the two themes that I'm going to pull out are big themes. They're weighty themes, they're heavy themes. But I want you to stick with me as I pull out these themes, because I really believe there's something in this for us, for our families, for our jobs, for our workplaces, and for our church as well. Here's the first. Every generation has the potential to positively change the course of history. Theme number one, every generation has the potential to positively change the course of history. The really interesting thing for me about the Bible is the Bible paints a picture of a relay and not a sprint. You look at the Bible, it's all about the relay. The Old Testament is this fascinating work that takes us from creation to just before Christ. And it helps us track the history of a people group through many, many generations and through that period of history. That's actually an amazing thing to be able to do. And what you see in that tracking is you see trends that emerge. And I think the trends that we see in the Old Testament are just as relevant to the world that we live in today. We have to take note of these. And the basic trend of the Old Testament is this: the way you have good leaders and willing people, there is blessing, there is positive blessing on the nation, on God's people. Where you have bad leaders and an unwilling or a rebellious people, there is a consequence that comes upon the nation as a result of the decisions that they make. It plays out right the way through the Bible. The slightly discouraging thing, and we're just going to touch on this now, get this out of the way. The slightly discouraging thing about the Old Testament is there weren't so many of the good guys. They spent a lot of time living under the consequence of poor decision making. But hey, let's just cut them some slack and say, isn't that the same for our lives too? Sometimes I think that I'm winning, but there are moments where I'm like, actually, I'm not winning right now. I thought I'd taken 2 steps forward, we're taking a step back. But this trend is really apparent in the Bible, and I think it serves as a warning to all of us, firstly, of what can happen if we take our eyes off succession, but moreover, the potential that there is within every generation to change the course of history. Good leaders in the context of the Old Testament are basically faithful to God. That's what it simply is. It's being faithful to God. And when they're faithful, their nation survives. And faithfulness really means they're committed to God's grace, to God's guidance, they're committed to God's covenant, they're committed to God's commands. Basically, what they do is they do what God tells them to do. They honor Him. They make Him a priority. Their lives focus in on and center around what He said. The opposite, the unfaithful leaders, the poor leadership that brings a consequence upon the people, it does the opposite. And it's all summed up in this one word, idolatry. Basically what happens when there's poor leadership or amongst the people is they choose not to build their lives around God, but instead they focus on a false god. They decide they're going to pursue other gods, that they're going to turn God from being God into a pocket god, or into a shrine that they go and worship at, or a stick that they set up in the city. They worship false gods. And as a result of this, there's a consequence for the people. It seems to me that this trend in the Bible is that a faithful generation enjoys God's favor, protection, and provision. And then the next generation comes along and builds on that blessing. And this is really played out in the story of David and Solomon. And we're going to talk a little bit about this as this message goes on. What happens for the people of Israel? They flee captivity in Egypt. They go around in circles in the wilderness for a while. And then they take possession of the promised land. And they're a group of tribes that coexist. And that coexistence typically is a little bit fraught. It's a little bit troubled. There's a lot of division. There's conflict. They have external enemies that come and try and take them out of the game. It's a really interesting history for them. And the people are ruled at one point by these people called judges. And the judges preside and they make decisions. And eventually the people have had enough of the judges and they decide that they want a king. And so they go to the prophet and they say, we want a king. And the prophet says to them, this is, by the way, a potted history of the Old Testament. And the prophet says to them, you don't want a king. And they say, we want a king. And he says, you don't want a king. And they say, we want a king. So he said, okay, have it your way, have a king, but be warned. And so Saul is selected from amongst the people as the king. Now, Saul's kind of rulership is a mixed bag, let's call it that. But a young man emerges from amongst the people, a shepherd called David. Now, what we learn about David is there's something about David's heart, character, and life that David achieves something, he delivers something into the nation that starts something new. And as a result of the decisions that David makes and the life that David lives, his son Solomon inherits something so much stronger than David himself inherited. Basically what it's saying is that a faithful generation enjoys God's favor, protection, and provision, and then the next generation gets to build upon this blessing. There's just a digression for a moment. There's kind of a story, and I just want to say, I'm not making a political point with this story. I'm just wanting to kind of illustrate what I'm saying here. There is a story in the UK, I'm sharing from the UK today, that when there was a change of government in the not too distant past, somebody took up their post in the treasury, in the part of government that deals with finance, and arrived at his new desk to find a letter on the desk saying, "I'm afraid there is no money." And, this kind of note that he found on his desk came to represent the sum of what had been achieved by the previous administration. Now, that wasn't really fair because the government that had gone before had actually achieved some amazing, amazing thing. And some person in government made the mistake of writing this note, and of course it got splashed all over the newspapers. But when the generation of government that had been in power, that had essentially spent all the money, stepped out, and another government steps in and takes over, what they realize is he's right, there is no money. And it kicks off what's known in the UK as an era of austerity, of painful and difficult cuts. Now, again, let's not get into the politics of it. The point is this, that the generation either builds on the successes of the previous generation, the next generation either builds on the successes of the previous generation, or it pays the price, it suffers the consequences of their weaknesses, of their failures. And hey, just to kind of add, as what I've just shared is discussed around homes in the UK, I just want to say, if you track back to the 1960s, the opposite thing happened to those governments. So anyway, plenty to have a look at there. Just for balance, don't want to be party political. You know where my loyalty lies. Anyway, let's move on. In the relay race, we set the next runner-up either to win or to fail. And it is the same in every single areas of our life. We can run as faithful people. We can run as committed people. We can run as forgiving people. We can run as gracious people. We can run as generous people. We can do all that we can do to set the next generation up to win. Or we can do the opposite and get stuck, get lost in the race, get caught up in the race. And as a result, whoever picks up the baton next has to deal with the hand effectively that they've been dealt by us. We get to choose whether they go on to win or whether we set them up for something else. Now, they may redeem what we set them up for. They may build on what we set them up for. They may take the brilliant hand that we've given them and waste it away. But the point is, there is this connection across the generations that we really need to be aware of. And I was thinking about this in terms of the life that Naomi and I have lived. And I think if Naomi and I were honest, we would say in some areas of our life, we haven't been, right now, we've got to this point, I'm in my mid-30s, we have 5 young children. There are some things that we have done well, and there are other things that we want to look at and work on and improve on to set up our children to win in their race. One of the things that I think that we've done well is I think that we have made some difficult and courageous decisions to give up some stuff in order to prioritize and honor God. Because one of the things that we said is if there's something we want our kids to grasp a hold of, it's that their success isn't measured by their bank balance. Their success isn't measured by the car that they drive around in or by the trophies on the shelf. Their success, there's something about success is measured in our willingness to be loyal to be devoted to God, to say actually him and his house is so important that we'll do whatever he calls us to do. We'll always say yes to Jesus, and we believe that's sown something, our willingness to do that. And I want to say to you the same thing. Your courage will set the next generation up to win. Your sacrifice will set the next generation up to win. Your determination to conquer and overcome the things that have held you back will set the next generation up to win, if you allow it to. And the opposite is also true. where I've struggled with issues in my life and I've said, you know what, I'm not going to deal with that right now. If there's an enduring pattern of behavior or a bad habit, or say, for example, that I had an addiction that I just couldn't shake, maybe it's gambling or something, and it's really costing my family money, it's going to drain potential out of our family to set the next generation up to win. This is what the Bible says in the book of Proverbs, Proverbs 28, verses 18 to 20. The one whose walk is blameless is kept safe, but the one whose ways are perverse will fall into the pit. Those who work their land will have abundant food, but those who chase fantasies will have their fill of poverty. I know it's heavy, isn't it? A faithful person will be richly blessed, but one eager to get rich will not go unpunished. This is the Bible. And just rewind to that one where it says, those who work the land will have abundant food. What it's saying is those that toil, those that invest themselves, those that work hard, those that give their all, will reap reward. But those who choose not to do that are lazy or chase fantasies, are going to sort of live in the consequences of that. You know, I wanted to finish this part of my message with this statement. Faithfulness is not a limited and temporary affair. It's a consuming and lifelong commitment because of the impact that it has on the next generation. Let me say that again. Faithfulness is not a limited and temporary affair. It is a consuming and lifelong commitment. You know, if I was to marry Naomi, for example, and say to Naomi, you know what, Naomi, I'm going to be with you for the rest of my life. Don't worry, I'll always be here. Actually, as part of our vows, I said to her that I would be faithful to her for the rest of our lives. And then 2 years in, she looked around, found that we had 17 children, and I'd vanished. You know, she's going to come and find me, isn't she? And she's going to say to me, okay, Kris, let's talk about this. I hope that she would come at me like that. I doubt she would actually. But anyway, she would come at me with a spear. Anyway, and she would find me, and she would say to me, look, you did a good couple of years there. You know, it was 2 good years that you gave me, but that does not equate to faithfulness. Because faithfulness is something that's season in, season out, decade in, decade out, year after year after year after year after year, till your dying breath. That's what faithfulness looks like. But I've noticed this thing in my life, and I've noticed this thing in the world that we're living in, that we started to believe that being faithful is measured over the sprint. It's like, you know what, they were there for a few months, they gave it their all for a few months. Faithful person. That's not faithfulness. That's a good couple of months. That's a limited and temporary affair. They 5 years of loyalty or 5 years of commitment, 5 years of diligence. Wow, faithful person. No. Faithfulness is a lifelong endeavor. Faithfulness is something that endures through the decades. Faithfulness is something that endures even when we least want to press on and move forward. You know, faithfulness is the thing that even when we stumble, brings us back into the game. When we're running the race and we drop the baton. Now, if you do this in athletics, they disqualify you, but I'm going to stretch the analogy for my own purposes here. Faithfulness is a thing that when we drop the baton, we decide, I'm not going to give up at this point. I made a mistake, things went wrong. I'm going to own that mistake. I'm going to grab the baton again, and I'm going to get back in the race, and I'm going to expend myself fully to get myself to the end of the race. You know, people cannot inherit from us what they do not see us model in our lives. People cannot inherit from us what they do not see us model in our own lives. And it's so important that we grasp at that. So that's the first theme that I want to talk about. Every single generation has the potential to positively shape the course of history. The second theme is this, that every one of us has a part to play. Every one of us has a part to play. When we zoom in on the bit of the Bible that I was talking about earlier, the bit of the succession of David to Solomon, it's really interesting to me that David has a specific call upon his life. He has a specific responsibility that is given to him by God, and that is summed up with the statement that David was called to be a man of war. When we look at Solomon's life, the Bible tells us that Solomon is called to be a man of peace, that he's called to achieve and do something else that David is other than what David was called to do. The point of this is that David has to live out his calling in order for Solomon to be able to step into his calling. It's a really interesting connection. Now, during David's life, David has much success. And David, at a stage of his life, he gets a vision to rebuild, to build a temple for God. It says in the Bible, David had fought these fights and he'd had these victories, and he gets it within his heart. And there's a whole bunch of context around this that we're going to park. But he gets this vision to build a temple for God. And what happens as David starts to embrace and pursue this vision is that he's told by God, that's not what I've called you to. That's what I've called Solomon and his generation. They're going to deal with the temple. You're called to be a man of war. You're called to establish something in your life that they will need for what they're called to. So let's just look at the Bible where it says this. It's recorded in 2 places in the Bible, but one of those is 1 Chronicles 22, 7-10. It said, David said to Solomon, my son, I had it in my heart to build a house for the name of the Lord my God. But this word, so this is David speaking to Solomon, but this word of the Lord came to me. You shed much blood and you fought many wars. You are not to build a house for my name because you've shed much blood on the earth in my sight. But you will have a son who will be a man of peace and rest, and I will give him rest from all his enemies on every side. His name will be Solomon, and I will grant Israel peace and quiet during his reign. He is the one who will build a house for my name. He will be my son, and I will be his father. I will establish the throne of his kingdom over Israel forever. So let's just park it there. So this is what God says to David. Hey, David, you've got this vision to build a temple. That's actually not what I'm calling you to do. It talks about you've got too much blood on your hands. What it's saying is you're a man of war. And if you read in the Bible, it's actually in another part of the Bible, you read this story, it goes on to explain in the next chapter how David focuses himself on a few things. And one of the things he focuses himself on is defeating all of the enemies around God's people that have, some of them have stood against God's people for generations and generations and generations. What David basically says is, look, God's not called me to build the temple. So rather than wanting to, do what God hasn't called me to do, I'm going to do what God has called me to do. And in so doing, I'm going to set up the generation that is to come for victory and for success. It's a really interesting thing because I think every single one of us in our life will get tempted at times to stray off script. We'll look at somebody else's calling and we'll say, why is it they get to do that? And yet in my life, I've been called to do this. How come we have to live this type of life or invest ourselves in this set of circumstances or expend ourselves in this way and they get to do all the fun stuff? We do that, don't we? We can look and we can say it's not fair. Look at their calling compared to my calling. Their calling is so much better. I think the point that the Bible is making here is we've got to do what we're called to do. Because if we don't do what we're called to do, guess what? They can't do what they're called to do either. If David had said, I'm going to build a temple anyway, because actually I think I'm good at building temples, and had said, God's obviously got this one wrong, and he started to build a temple, he would have been unfaithful. And as a result of his unfaithfulness, he would have brought trouble and calamity upon the people. There would have been a great price that they paid because of his disobedience. That's not what David does. David reconciles himself to the fact that as nice as it would be to be that leader that leaves that legacy, that has that heritage, that's not his calling. And so David instead invests everything that he has in preparing the way for Solomon to succeed. Let me say that again. David, recognizing that he was not the one called to build the temple, spends all the rest of his life investing all that he has in setting up the next generation to win. It's profound. There isn't angst between David and Solomon. There isn't frustration for David because Solomon's getting to do what he wanted to do. Instead, David says, okay, I've got an opportunity now in this generation, in our life, to set Solomon up for the win. And I'm just going to read a short extract explaining some of what David does as he responds to this call from God. It's from 1 Chronicles 29. It says, then King David turned to the entire assembly and said, my son Solomon, whom God has clearly chosen as the next king of Israel, is still young and inexperienced. The work ahead of him is enormous, for the temple he will build is not for mere mortals, it's for the Lord God himself. Using every resource at my command, I've gathered as much as I could for the building of the temple of God. Now there is enough gold, silver, bronze, iron, and wood, as well as great quantities of onyx, I practiced that. Onyx, other precious stones, costly jewels, and all kinds of fine stones and marble. So let's just see what David's done there. What he's saying is, having received this instruction from God, having reconciled myself to the call that is on my life upon our generation. He'd actually engaged heavily in war. He continued to be the man of war that God had called him to be, to establish the nation as God had called him to establish it. And then he said, he mobilized the nation to start stockpiling, to start saving, to start amassing an incredible bounty of treasure to make it possible for Solomon to do what he was called to do. So he used his role and his position to position the nation for success, but he did more than that. Goes on to say, and now because of my devotion to the temple of God, I'm giving all my private treasures of gold and silver to help in the construction. This is in addition to the building materials I've already collected for his holy temple. I'm donating more than 112 tons of gold from Ophir and 262 tons of refined silver to be used for overlaying the walls of the buildings and for the other gold and silver work to be done by the craftsmen. I mean, isn't that exceptional? I mean, firstly, the guy was rich, man. If gold and silver are a measure of success, he did it. Did real well, this boy. Went from let's just take a moment. He went from the field as a shepherd, delivering sandwiches to his brothers, and he was faithful to God. And now he's giving 112 tons of gold. We measure gold in ounces, 112 tons of gold. Incredible, incredible, incredible. He takes his private wealth. Really what it's saying, I think, is he takes all that he has. In addition to using his role and his work and his connections and all that to mobilize what is needed for the next generation, he then takes all that he personally has and he piles it into the pile. He brings it and offers it. And then he does this. Now then, who will follow my example and give offerings to the Lord today? Then the family leaders, the leaders of the tribes of Israel, the generals and captains of the army, and the king's administrative officers all gave willingly for the construction of the temple of God. They gave about 188 tons of gold. I had this moment when I was preparing this message when I got a bit distracted. Happens a lot. And I was like, I wonder how much 188 tons of gold is worth today. $7.5 billion. That's a lot of gold. 10,000 gold coins, 375 tons of silver, 675 tons of bronze, and 3,750 tons of iron. They also contributed numerous precious stones, which were deposited in the treasury of the house of the Lord under the care of Jehiel, a descendant of Gershom. The people rejoiced over the offerings. I bet they did. For they had given freely and wholeheartedly to the Lord. And King David was filled with joy. David mobilizes through his role, through his position, through his status, the nation to prepare for what comes next. He does everything that he can personally do. He gives all that he has to prepare for what comes next. And then he leans on all of his contacts and connections. He mobilizes his influence to prepare for what comes next as well. And in so doing, he sets the next generation up to win. I think it's such a different picture to the picture that I see today of how generations set the next generation up for the win. At times we would say, well, hang on, my wealth is my wealth. These guys need to go earn their own wealth. They need to go do it themselves. At times we might look and say, I'm not content not to get to do that thing. I want it all and I want it now. That's the spirit of our generations. That's the spirit of the age that we live in. Rather than waiting and equipping and readying these guys to do it even better than we've done, I want to lament or be frustrated in the fact that I've not got to do it myself. That's the world that we tend to live in. And as a result, each generation, at each passing on of the baton, there's a stumbling in the race. As a result, at times it can be like the people that were unfaithful to God. At each successive generation, there's a restart that has to happen, a renewing that has to happen to try and take ground that has been lost or given up in previous generations. And I think God wants something more for his church. Imagine if the church today, imagine if we, the church today, said, you know what? We're going to try and achieve some great things for God in our lifetime, but actually what we want to do is we want to leave something, a legacy, an inheritance, a provision for the generation that comes next. So that rather than being a kind of a one-sprint wonder, there is a godly generational relay race that happens that sees more people reached and impacted all over the world. That's the kind of thing that takes the gospel to the ends of the earth. That's the kind of thing that fulfills all that we're called to fulfill and honors God. It's challenging, but it's true. It's challenging, but it's true. I think we have an amazing opportunity to set the next generation up to win. And so I'm going to finish up with 7 points. Yes, 7. I mean, somebody pointed out this morning, that's the biblical number for completion. I was like, that's a coincidence. Okay, 7 points that we can embrace in order to set the next generation up to win. And can I just say this? I'm speaking to you in this room if you're 70 years old, but I'm speaking to you in this room if you're 17 years old today. This isn't something you park, and I'm going to just finish on this, but this isn't something you park and worry about in 30 years' time. This is something that we all have to engage with. I was passing things on to others, as somebody who worked in retail to pay my way as a student. I was passing things on to others when I was studying and I was, working with people and I was volunteering. Throughout our lives, succession is relevant to us. Succession is important to us. Here's the first thing that we can do. I've already said it. Number 1, we live faithfully. We commit our lives to being faithful to God. We commit our lives to being faithful to God. And we allow that requirement to live faithfully to expand and to impact every area of our life. How many of us, if we were honest at times, stumble on the fundamentals, generosity, giving into God's house? We can get caught up in these really basic things. Living faithfully means we're going to do whatever God calls us to do, and we're going to do it with all of our heart, to love him with all of our heart, with all our soul, with all of our minds. There's something about giving ourselves fully to living faithfully. Number 2, we need to fulfill our calling. Embrace your calling, whether it seems grand or it seems humble. Just do what God's called you to do, because it's about more than just how you feel or what you feel or perceive yourself to have achieved in your life. It sets those who come next up to win in their walk. And I just think that gives something of value, something of encouragement to us, doesn't it, when we think about the call upon our lives. There are moments in my life where I've compared my calling and I've said, why didn't I get to be the guy that made all the money and drove around in the really nice car? That would have been awesome. And God's like, just do what I've called you to do and don't worry about that stuff. Fulfill your calling. The third thing, champion their calling. Champion their calling. Look at David's example of faithfulness. He grabbed a hold of Solomon's calling, and I think he owned it more than Solomon did or could before Solomon had even engaged with his calling. He said, I'm going to give the balance of my life to Solomon's calling. I'm going to make my calling his calling so that he can go on to do what God has called him to do. I think so often we don't champion the calling of the next generation. When people take over from us at work, we can be a little bit edgy, can't we? Right. So I wouldn't have done it that way. Well, I'm not sure I would really do it that way. And they're doing all right, but it's not how we would have done it. That's not championing their calling. That's being critical. Championing their calling means we're going to own it. We're going to own that thing. Number 4, provide sacrificially. David gave $7.5 billion of gold. What are you giving? No, I'm kidding. Provide sacrificially. There's something about us having a vision. I really wanted to say that I think some of us have a vision in life. I just want enough to get by. I want to be generous. I want to give. And I want, a comfortable retirement when I've stopped work in the future. What would happen if you were to get a vision for leaving much, much more than that to the generation that is to come? What if you were to say, actually, God, what I leave will either unlock potential and calling within the next generation, or it will inhibit it. So I'm going to get a vision to leave a lot, to pass on a lot, to provide a lot. Now I've seen, we're part of an amazingly generous church where people do give sacrificially. And I've seen people give their kids, being in the fortunate position to give their kids deposits to buy houses. And in so doing, they put their children in a home. It's an incredible legacy, isn't it? It's like, we're going to give you can't do this on your own. You're doing your best, but let us give you a hand up to help move you forward. And it's been a great blessing. And I know not all of us can do that, and that's okay. God's got this. But there's something about having a vision to be able to provide sacrificially. The next thing is equipping them well. Go read 1 Chronicles, and see how David did all that he could do to prepare the plans for the palace, to structure society in a way that would facilitate the building of the temple. The plans for the temple. Solomon also built a palace, but that's another story. The plans for the temple, the people to build the temple. It says that they started to prepare the stones that could be used, stockpiling the stones so that when the building came to happen, there's something about equipping people well for what's ahead. That means that there's gold within you that needs to be invested in those that come next. I really think at times we can hold back from sharing what's in our hearts and bringing what's in our hearts. We say, well, it's not my responsibility. They're running the race now. There's a way, isn't there, of coming alongside those that have stepped up and are stepping forward and saying, hey, I just want to share what God has placed within my heart to be able to help. I've been in situations before where I've been the leader, but I've been younger than other people in the room. And I've seen them step in and say, hey, why don't we try this? And I've seen an amazing fruit as a result of me getting out of the way and letting them share their wisdom. There's something about receiving wisdom down the generational lines. How can we set the next generation up to win? Release them to lead. I love the fact in our church that when I come in on a Sunday, I see people on stage who are young, who are passionate, who are going for it. I love the fact that right now around the world, we've got people long in their 60s leading locations, but we've also got people in their 20s as well. I love Gary and Heather's heart as our leaders constantly to release the next generation to lead. I think releasing the next generation to lead means to say it's a priority to us that we see people released, stepping into leadership, taking on responsibility. And finally, number 7, maybe the hardest of all, follow passionately. Follow passionately. Where we see people stepping up. You know what? When I step down as a leader within our church, somebody else is going to take forward what I've built. I really pray. I'm praying now that my heart is prepared now to follow that person passionately when they do the things that I think are awesome, but when they do the things that I would never do, that I might look at and say, I wouldn't do it that way, I'm not sure what that's all about, that I follow passionately. There's something about following passionately that is important within succession. So just rounding this off, when it comes to succession, succession is not a moment in life. It is a way of life. And it's a way that God blesses. And it builds for God, and it achieves something far, far more for God than we realize. The amazing thing, David does all that he does to set Solomon up for the win. And Solomon's generation in the history of Israel is known as the golden era of the nation of Israel. It's an era of unprecedented success, of unprecedented nation building. They build the temple, they build Solomon's palace, they trade with all of the known world. People come from afar to try and understand how it is they're achieving what they've achieved. Because of David's faithfulness, because of the way he lives his life, because of his legacy, Solomon's generation really achieves what no generation previously had been able to achieve. But here's the tragedy. Solomon, in his success, made some poor decisions. And as a result of his poor decisions, he sowed the seeds that led the people from a place of unprecedented success to division, to exile, to being scattered all over the world. It says that Solomon had hundreds of wives and hundreds of concubines from all over the world, and they brought with them their religions. And it stirred idolatry basically within the hearts of the people. The faithfulness turned to unfaithfulness. And what happened? You saw a loss as a result. The reason that I'm sharing this as part of this series, and hey guys, I know there's been a lot in this message, and this has been a long message, but I actually make no apologies for that because I believe that this is a word in season for our church right now. As I was preparing this message, God gave me 2 words that I couldn't shake from my spirit, and they were these words, the final push. Maybe you believe what I believe, and that's that Jesus is coming back. The Bible tells us, doesn't it? He will return. Be ready for when he returns. I really believe that Jesus is going to come back for his church, for his bride. But there's some stuff that we've got to get done before that happens. And I really believe that there's something about us as the church having the mentality of the final push. I don't know about you, but there's those moments in the game where we see that the end is in sight, and so we give more than we would otherwise have given. We mobilize or motivate more within ourselves to achieve more, to expend more, to leave more than perhaps we would have otherwise have left. I really believe that the church in this generation needs to have the mentality of the final push. I'm not saying that next week, when you're eating your Kellogg's cornflakes, Jesus is going to return. We've been expecting this for over 2,000 years. One thing that we can agree on is each day that passes moves us closer to that moment. And that moment's going to be glorious. It's going to be glorious for those of us that are in him anyway. I want to challenge us as a church to have the mentality, when it comes to succession, the final push mentality, that in our lives, the various roles, the various things that we will do, the various positions that we'll hold in our lives, we will focus upon achieving, but also upon good succession, positive succession, setting the next generation up for the win. But I also want us with the whole of our lives to have that mentality as well. I want us to go home as husbands and wives, as young people, have the conversation. How am I going to use my life, not just to achieve through my life, but to create a legacy that will mean that those that come next can go further and do more than I can do. You know, as this has got into my thinking, I've started to question decisions that I've made, priorities within my life. I've started to see things differently. We've started to say, maybe we don't need that after all. It would be great, but you know what? Somebody could do more with that, create more value if we were to release it, if we were to sow it, if we were to store it up for times ahead.